In this video, I'm gonna respond to a couple of videos, one by Academic Agent and one by Cameron MacGregor. And my argument is that these guys are on the right. And my general problem with some of the discussion on the right is that it adopts a kind of broad macro stance. And my stance is, you could say, Austro-Libertarian. And the problem with the macro kind of arguments is that they end up actually sounding very leftist. And also, I don't think they're helpful. And so my argument is that really the only legitimate type of argument is a kind of the praxeological type of approach that was developed by the Austrian school economists, in particular Ludwig von Mises. Now, I'm not going to discuss in detail praxeology, but I wanted to kind of point out how arguments by people like Academic Agent, Parvini, and then in another recent video, Cameron MacGregor was arguing that the current Chinese government is a legitimate regime that is somehow a positive thing for the Chinese population. And my response to that is a kind of Austro-Libertarian type analysis. And and what I want to show in this is that what you see, the way you analyze something, really depends on your background framework, your theoretical framework. And you can have two people looking at the same facts and seeing something completely different because of the different framework. And so really the question is, well, which is first of all, which is the better framework in terms of, and then how, you have to kind of have some ways of deciding in terms of internal consistency, predictiveness, and stuff like that. And my problem is people on the right, they reject libertarianism. Parvini makes statements saying that libertarians are useful idiots. So I'm guessing he's anti-libertarian. And I want to distinguish libertarians generally, like, for example, the various libertarian parties, which I don't really believe in, like the Libertarian Party here in Australia, here in New South Wales. I think they're a joke. And so they're giving people like me a bad name, even though I don't think they are really libertarian. They're kind of the low tax, basically what liberals used to be. Like here in Australia, there was a Liberal Party, and they were social conservative, and then low tax, low spending, balance the budget. And that's what the libertarians are here are now, because the liberals have just gone woke or something. I'm not really sure. I don't really follow it. That's not libertarianism, or that's not the Austrian school. So the Austrian school that I follow in terms of the political aspect of it and the ideological aspect is the Hermann Hoppe approach, which he expresses in books like Democracy That Failed. And I don't really see why there's anything wrong with that approach. And that's the approach that I want to use in terms of critiquing recent statements by people, by Parvini and by MacGregor. So I'm generally sympathetic to their right-wing sentiments and their anti-left sentiments, but my worry is that because of their kind of macro stance, which Parvini justifies by his elite theory. I'm still learning, learning about his approach and becoming familiar with it. But he's got a book, The Populist Delusion, and then he argues that it's all about the elites fighting it out. And I'm not against that. I don't fully understand this argument, but his recent reliance on an argument, an economic argument of Lenin, from Lenin's book, to me, that points to a serious problem in terms of that approach. So I'm going to look at that and then sort of make my comments. And then I'm going to look at, I'm going to use that kind of as a preamble to looking at Cameron MacGregor's video on China as some kind of a positive example of governance. Because I think that I hear that I just keep hearing that kind of an argument, in particular from the left, and now it's from the right. And I think it's this kind of very high level macro position, very general position that doesn't look at things at a micro level. And I think that the Austrian School of Economics, in particular, praxeology, is really the proper framework for looking at these things. And I think it can also be used to critique these libertarian parties. Hoppe calls them Lala libertarians, basically left libertarians, pro drug legalization kind of libertarians. And then you also have these pseudo-libertarians who are basically what used to be conservative and economically liberal parties, like the ones in Australia. They are statists. They're basically statists. So they're not. You can't be a statist and a libertarian. So there's that kind of confusion about libertarianism. So what I want to do is I want to say libertarianism, understood as a framework, as a theoretical framework, the praxeological theoretical framework, can give us a better picture of things and avoid the pitfalls that I see in approaches, analyses like Parvini's and MacGregor's. So let's have a look at Parvini's video, and I commented on it, and let me have a look. So in this video, which was 3 days ago, Elon Musk versus the people. So this is very current because it's the whole issue with Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy going head to head against MAGA, or a lot of the influencers who, and this actually started with Nick Fuentes because he was kind of early on pointing out that the incoming people, the people coming in in the incoming administration, like Trump's administration, they're actually all pro-immigration, and the Trump, said that he's going to staple a green card to every diploma. So he was really early on pointing this out. And then, surprise, surprise, he was doxxed, and the posts that were doxing him on Twitter were not removed. for a long time until the attempt on him by that guy with a gun. So this is really snowballing, and it's an ongoing thing, and now it's really reaching a lot of it's getting a lot of energy, the issue.
Quote unquote mask off.
So let's have a listen.
They were called a black pillar who needs to get into the crystal and so on. Yet somehow now, after a week is a long time in politics. It's funny, about a week or so ago, anyone who voiced concerns about the direction of the incoming Trump administration was said to be spoiling my vibes. They were called a black pillar who needs to get into the crystal and so on. Yet somehow now, after a few truly awful tweets by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, stating exactly what they have said dozens of times before, the exact same concerns about the exact same people have suddenly gone mainstream, as we are told that they have gone quote-unquote mask off about things that were patently pools of slop.
Okay, so he's quoting here someone saying, needless to say, I couldn't give two flying Fs for how successful Apple, Google, and Tesla are or are not. So what you have here is the right, meaning academic agent, pointing out that there's this position on the right that is not economically determinist, right? So what they're saying is economics isn't everything. There are cultural and social values that are more important than economics. And so we have to take those other values into account, and just talking constantly about whether American companies are winning and making money and winning economic wars with other countries, that is not the highest priority. So it has to do with the priorities of on the right, right? Is economics the main priority, or is culture the main priority?
A little tweet by Morgoth which caught my eye, and it somewhat got to the nub of the issue. Morgoth said, needless to say, I couldn't give two flying Fs how successful Apple, Google, and Tesla are or are not. Now in this video, I want to focus less on Musk or Ramaswamy and more on why it is that the merchant class that they represent, why those who champion their brand of pro-capitalist liberalism are so hooked on mass immigration.
So academic agent has this theory that, or it's not his theory, but it's a theory that he subscribes to, that you have in different times in a particular in a given country, different kind of elite will rule. So it might be the warrior class, the priestly class, or the merchant class. And modern Western democracies are basically ruled by the merchant class, which seems to be the bourgeoisie, right? And so in this analysis, he's agreeing with Marxists, because Marxists basically were, the whole Marxist thing is that the bourgeoisie became the ruling elite. And so you need communism to overcome their rule, because their rule is inherently oppressive and exploitative.
Now on this point, I have never been convinced by the argument put forward by some rightists that it is simply ethnic revenge or hatred. This has never really struck me as ringing true. If someone has an idea which is genuinely predictive, that is, it has genuine predictive power, I think we should pay attention to it, even if that person is bad in many other ways. Now, one such idea was put forward.
Okay, so here academic agent makes a very quick argument why we should read Lenin. So he's a bad person, but he has a predictive idea, a predictive economic idea. Now it's a there are massive red flags here because I mean, how predictive are Lenin's ideas when basically they destroyed Russia and enslaved its population? I mean, it must be he must have that one predictive idea, because everything else must have been wrong, because his idea was 5-year plans. So he must have, his economics, just if you think about it logically in a priori, if this guy had 5-year plans and his economic theory is so predictive, then Russia would be really rich, which was what the expectation, that Russia is going to be way more successful economically than the West. So, but I guess there is one idea that Lenin had, one economic theory that was really predictive. Let's see, what is this theory?
Forward by a man who was bad in many ways, a certain Vladimir Lenin. In his Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, written in 1917...
Now I have to say that I'm Polish and I grew up for the first 10 years of my life under the Soviet system in Poland. So I have first-hand experience of how the Polish economy was completely decimated by socialism and state planning. You had a highly educated, hardworking population, the exact same population that you have today, right? High levels of education, intelligence, okay, social cohesion, religiousness. You had all the factors that you would imagine are needed for the society to prosper. And you had a state, which was a technocratic state that was planning, right, was doing these 5-year plans, and it completely destroyed the economy, where basically there were shortages of everything, lines. I remember standing in those lines as a child, right? Basics. You couldn't get fish. You couldn't get meat. You couldn't get anything. There were empty shelves in supermarkets, literally empty shelves. And the party, every time they had a plan, they were going to fix the economy this way or that way, right? And this was throughout the whole Soviet system. It was the same. All these countries were economically corrupted, defunct. So yeah, I am biased in this whole idea, in this whole idea that somehow socialism has anything to teach us other than it's a bad idea. I'm very biased. Okay, let's continue.
Lenin made a number of observations and predictions about the general trend in global capitalism. Incidentally, a handy book, if you're into reading Lenin, is the 3-volume Selected Works, which has all the essential stuff. Now, before we get into Lenin's comments on immigration, it is first important to understand what he means by imperialism. Here, he is not necessarily talking about, for example, the British Empire in and of itself run by the British state, but rather as the empire and British state as a kind of racket and front for the capitalist rentier class. In the history of this channel, I have often pointed out, for example, that the British Empire, that is, the British government, spent £2 for every £1 it got back in foreign trade. But Lenin tackles this point.
Okay, so the British Empire spent £2 spent on what? And how did it get something back? You mean taxes? So it spent it on what, infrastructure? Okay, so it spent £2 on infrastructure and got back £1 in taxes. Is that would be more concrete? Now, this is the problem: is we don't know how this data was obtained, at which point in time, right? And what were the motivations for a particular investment? For example, the British Empire sent convicts to Australia, so they benefited by getting rid of criminals and had free labor. It's this is the whole problem with this macro view. And then this rentier thing. So I'm not an expert, and so I kind of asked ChatGPT to explain these concepts to me. I find in the area where I'm an expert, like neuroscience, that kind of stuff, education, I find that ChatGPT gives me what I would consider accurate information. So if I want some detail and I can see the context and I can see, yeah, it's reading the actual literature and it's getting things right based on my independent understanding of the area. So I'm assuming that what ChatGPT is giving me about economics is reasonably accurate as well. So here's what, so I asked him about this rentier thing, and ChatGPT is saying, Lenin, the highest stage of capitalism, he refers to rentiers as those who derive income not from productive work, but from financial investments, particularly in the form of interest and dividends from capital exported abroad. Okay, so it's not from productive work. So I'm guessing they're not making the shoes themselves. They're investing in machines and land. So, basic high school economics, the way enterprise works is the entrepreneur invests, buys land, right, buys machines and employs labor and puts it together. And then there's takes a risk. So he expects to gain a profit because he's taking a risk, right? He could put that money in a bank and gain a certain percentage, but he or she decides to invest that, take a risk, and gain a larger profit. That's high school economics. So rentiers, according to this, are just business people, right? So it's a kind of a derogatory view, term that, Lenin, being a communist and a Marxist, thinks that if you're an entrepreneur, you are inherently evil. You're an exploiter, right? That's how communists think. Well, why is Parvini, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name correctly, parroting this stuff? It's baffling. I'm baffled. Okay, so not from productive work. So being an entrepreneur is not productive. but from financial investments. Well, you need financial investments in any large company. No one will have enough money, right? So they're gonna need money from investors. For example, when I was at university, there was another guy. He was also Polish. I'm Polish, right? Or Polish background, Polish born. And he was studying philosophy, but he was working in a computer chip plant here in Sydney. And he took me there and I went to look at it, and it was like, you're wearing this kind of a white suit. The air is like super duper filtered. And he was showing me all the machines that they were using to manufacture computer chips. And he was saying that the reason he is studying, doing a PhD in philosophy is because he's going to be out of a job because there isn't enough capital, there's not enough money in Australia to sustain this industry. Only large countries like the US or China or these kinds of large countries can have enough capital, means financial resources, to manufacture computer chips. These kinds of things are very capital intensive. So not a single, how are you going to do it if you don't have financial investment? I mean, okay, that's the only way you can do it. But so rentiers, that it's not from productive work. I mean, it's just so funny reading this. It's so ridiculous. But from financial investments. So financial investments are not productive, particularly in the form of interest or dividends from capital. So it's basically, this typical communist denigration of finance, which is basically voluntary, people voluntarily giving their money in expectation of getting, more back, which is a voluntary thing. You have a money, it's your money. No, the communists will not allow you to do what you want with your money. Not allowed. You see, communism is not a voluntarist system. Okay, obviously, because it's not productive somehow. You're being exploited. You see, it's all just aspersions, right, and characterization based around the whole theory that capitalism is exploitative. To continue, this concept aligns with his analysis of imperialism as the domination of finance capital, where wealthier nations exploit less developed ones through investments that generate substantial returns for their capital owning classes. Okay. I mean, there's so many. Yeah. Well. Yeah. You have to exploit if your country has resources, and you want to modernize your country. You're gonna have to give something up to get something back. Like if you are, I don't know. I mean, it's just how the world works. That's how. Without that, there will be just poverty. So basically, rentier class is just business people, entrepreneurs. That's what it means, as far as I can tell from this. So we are Marxists now on the right. Is that the conclusion I should draw? I don't understand. I'm baffled. So now the tone of this is because is due to the fact that it seems, as far as I can tell, ChatGPT is getting this from Leninist, Marxist websites. So the tone is kind of in favor of Lenin's position. So the figure serves as, this serves as Lenin's argument that imperialism fosters a parasitic and decaying form of capitalism. Now, what has been the experience after Lenin's writings? Which form of economy, the Soviet or the Western, resulted in parasitic and decaying form of capitalism, assuming that capitalism means industrialization. So if you substitute capitalism, form of economics and industrial economic, let's say. So which type of system, the Soviet system, Lenin's Soviet system, or the, more or less free market system of the West, fostered a parasitic and decaying form of industrial economics? Well, I'm sorry, I grew up before, my family, basically in 1980, Polish people, anyone who could leave Poland, they did. People were voting with their feet and leaving because there was no hope. We didn't know in 1980 that by 1989, the whole thing would collapse. It just looked inevitable and it will never change. And people basically decided to leave, and my family left, came to Australia because it was parasitic, socialism was parasitic and decaying. Okay. The rentier income is a marker of how imperialist nations extract surplus value from global exploitation. I mean, let's say you have something in the ground and you're like an undeveloped country. Like you just don't have machines. You don't have capital to extract the value from the ground. Let's say you're sitting on a ton of oil, but you don't have the oil rigs. You don't have any way to extract the oil. And then a rich country comes and says, well, we're going to extract the oil and you're going to have to pay us this amount. And let's say it's a lot. But the thing is, without that capital, you will have nothing. Right? The right position, the position on the right, which I think is the correct one, which is the voluntarist, is that it should be a decision made by the country that has the resource, whether they're willing to have that resource exploited, quote unquote, for a certain amount of money. And it's their choice whether they prefer to get nothing and to have that resource sit in the ground, or whether they prefer to have the imperialist nation, the rich country, typically like a European country or the US, to extract the surplus value, whatever that means. I think it's a meaningless term, but let's say we go along to extract that value from global exploitation, right? It's all characterization of what I think is legitimate economic activity that has, enriched people, populations that would otherwise have nothing. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't exploitation. The point is that this type of analysis is too broad and too crude to tell you at what point are we dealing with exploitation, and at what point are we dealing with legitimate, reasonable economic exchange. It's all bad. According to Lenin, it's all bad. Well, why would you accept that? I'm not saying it's all good, but his analysis doesn't tell us when it's good and when it's bad, because it doesn't distinguish between voluntary and involuntary exchange. because it doesn't believe that voluntary exchanges are legitimate. It wants to force everyone to conform to their 5-year plans. And people on the right would just even, because it's predictive. It's predictive. I don't even know. Anyway, so it's unsustainable. So Lenin sees this as unsustainable and a source of inevitable conflict, wars over control of markets and resources. Well, I think the free market is, if it's voluntary, is the least likely to lead to wars, whereas the state is the most likely to lead to. So he's confusing here this capitalism, and which he calls the rentier class, as a free market operation, which is voluntary, from those forms of capitalism which use state power. He just lumps everything together as being basically all capitalism. But he doesn't. What is the reasoning here? Okay. So to go back to Parvini's video, so this is from Lenin. The annual income Great Britain derives from commissions. So commissions, I guess, means like taxes from colonial trade. So I guess they charge a commission on trade, and that's estimated by, and I think that Lenin got this from this guy Hobson, because I asked GPT, and that's what ChatGPT told me. Where is it? So he's getting this from statistical reports. Lenin references works by economists like J.A. Hobson, Imperialism, a Study, and Rudolf Hilferding, Finance Capital, who analyzes scale of capital exports and returns. Hobson estimated that Britain's capital exports generated large annual returns from foreign investments. Now, think about it in today's terms, right? We have people looking at these measures like CPI, Consumer Price Index, GDP, unemployment. Are people now currently believing these numbers? Because all I see is everyone going like, no, all these numbers are fake. And people start looking into how these numbers are calculated, and they're realizing none of it is the real economy. And the Austrian position, okay, I asked ChatGPT about the position on macroeconomics. So macroeconomics, right? When you study economics, you have macroeconomics and microeconomics. And microeconomics is the economics of the enterprise, of the business, right? Price setting, supply and demand curve, that kind of stuff. Macroeconomics is these aggregate numbers like unemployment rate, consumer price index, GDP. So what ChatGPT told me is Austrian school economists such as Ludwig von Mises take a unique approach to economics, particularly on inner view of macroeconomics. Unlike mainstream schools, Keynesian monetarists, etc., the Austrian school is critical of the concept of macroeconomics as it is traditionally understood. So the first point is focus on microeconomics over macroeconomics. Austrian economists emphasize the importance of individual actions and market processes over aggregated macroeconomic concepts like GDP, unemployment rates, or inflation indices. Von Mises in particular argued that economic phenomena can only be understood by analyzing the actions of individuals, which is methodological individuals. Aggregates, in their view, obscure the underlying causes of economic events. So aggregates obscure the underlying causes of economic events. So currently we are, for example, discussing inflation or mass immigration. So these are, so you go to the shop and suddenly eggs cost $9. A carton of eggs costs $9. Or like for me here, suddenly the place has completely changed. Just millions of immigrants. So here's a concrete event. Suddenly the population of the city changes drastically and visibly and quickly, or the price changes. So it's a concrete thing, and you go, what explains this? What is the underlying cause? Assuming that immigration is an economic event. And what the Austrians are saying is that the aggregates do not really tell us. If you say, okay, there's a million immigrants and these are the aggregates, and this is what's causing it to rejection of aggregates. So they were skeptical. So the Austrian economists were skeptical of the use of broad economic aggregates like national income, so that's GDP, or total demand. They argued that these aggregates fail to account for the complex and heterogeneous nature of individual preferences, resource allocation, and prices. Instead, they stress the role of relative prices, which communicate information about supply and demand for specific goods and services. So my understanding of this is that they focus on incentives, right? So you have to look at let's say, you have a lot of immigrants, but they're from, different countries. The incentives for the different groups will be different. There won't be a single explanation, right? You've got to kind of break it down to particular incentives and whether the price, let's say the price of labor for this group, right, incentivizes them to work or not to work. And so you kind of have to dig down more locally. That's the point. When you make, when you have these big broad generalizations, usually they're not very informative. That's my understanding of this anyway. And so I'm going to run with that. So relative prices means, well, basically, relatively high price means there's a shortage and there's the demand outstrips supply, right? So here rents are going up, they're too high. So there's too much demand and not enough supply. So then the question is, well, why? Why is there suddenly very high demand and there's not, the supply isn't there to meet the demand? Three, criticism of government intervention and macroeconomic planning. Austrian school economists are highly critical of government policies based on macroeconomic theories such as fiscal stimulus or monetary manipulation. Mises viewed policies like deficit spending and central bank interventions as distortions of the natural functioning of markets. He believed that they lead to boom and bust cycles, right? So people are pointing out to high rents, and then the government says, okay, we're gonna provide money for construction. So they're going to intervene in the market. But the thing is that from the Austrian point of view, what's happening is that there are blockages to the normally, if prices are high in a normally naturally functioning free market, the demand would, the supply, in this case, construction of new buildings, would come in to meet the demand. And this should happen without interference of the government. So the question is, why isn't the supply coming in to meet the demand, which would then lower the prices? Because there are obviously there are too many taxes, too many regulations. That's the only explanation. So in other words, the government is gonna throw money, which it doesn't have. It has to either tax more or print the money, causing more inflation, general inflation, to fix a problem that is caused by the government, namely by high taxes and regulations. And this is the general point of view of the Austrian school of government basically solving problems by throwing money at it that it has created in the first place, and then by intervening in the market, creating further problems, right? So yeah, maybe some people are now able to get housing because the government has thrown the problem, but then this causes general inflation for everybody, causing problems for businesses, causing unemployment, etc., etc. So it's fixing something visible by causing less visible problems, right? So this is kind of the visible invisible distinction is very important in the Austrian school, which is saying, okay, the original example was, well, when someone throws a brick and breaks a window, this creates economic growth because the person has to replace the window and they have to spend money and provide employment for the window maker. But there's an invisible cost to all of that, where there are alternative things that the money would have been spent on, providing other economic benefits. And so the Keynesian kind of, Keynes argued that you can create economic growth by digging ditches and then covering them up. And you see a lot of that. That's not just hypothetical, that is a reality. I see that a lot. So they're talking about the business cycle, right? So the business cycle, according to Austrians, is created by government spending, which means the business cycle means economic expansion leading to inflation, and then that leads to recession. You either get high inflation, then the state tries to curb the inflation, for example, by raising interest rates, manipulating interest rates, which then causes businesses to reduce their activity because now they have to spend money on the interest or that kind of thing, right? Or they might the government might increase the taxes. So either way, that negatively affects the business activity, leading to recession. So you have the kind of boom and bust. The cornerstone of Austrian macroeconomic thought is the Austrian business cycle theory, which argues that artificial low interest rates set by central banks distort the structure of production by encouraging excessive investment in long-term projects that are unsustainable. When these investments fail to align with actual consumer preferences, the economy enters a bust phase a recession or depression. So you see, people see that and they assume that somehow this is a problem with capitalism when it's really the problem with state intervention in the free market. Austrian, so here, this is interesting. Before I go back to Parvini's video, subjective value and the limits of macroeconomic measurement. Austrian economists argue that value is subjective and cannot be meaningfully aggregated across individuals, right? So we can't read people's minds and tell what it is that they prefer. The only way you can tell what people prefer is by looking at what they actually do. In other words, when they have a range of options, which is the option that they choose at that point in time tells us this is what they want. You can't predict it, and there's no other way of telling what people want other than by their individual vote in the market when they purchase something. This skepticism extends to measures like GDP, which they view as arbitrary and incomplete indicators of economic well-being. In essence, Austrian economists reject the traditional macroeconomic framework of aggregates and government intervention. Instead, they advocate for an analysis rooted in individual decision-making, market processes, and the importance of free market capitalism. For them, macroeconomic issues like recessions or inflation are best understood as consequences of distortions introduced by government or central bank policies rather than inherent flaws in the market system. Okay, so this all sounds right to me. I'm gonna take ChatGPT's word for it. But that's my understanding based on spending a lot of time listening to the Mises Institute lectures, reading some of the books, and just my general background. I studied high school economics, and I've always had an interest in economics. So if you look at this, okay, so we're dealing now with aggregates. And we don't know how much of this involves state intervention in the free market and how much of it is basically people engaging in voluntary economic transactions. Because what it's saying here is that imperialism means that the state, the government made these investments, but I don't know enough, and we're not told here how much of this was private money. And individuals risking their capital, right, to build enterprises and then gain legitimate profit from their investments, right? There was a lot of slavery, there was a lot of exploitation, but it wasn't all based on that, right? If like for example, Argentina, they had farms. I guess they took the land from the natives, so you could say that that was illegitimate. But let's take, say, countries like Australia, now they're claiming that Aborigines owned Australia. Now there were not enough Aborigines to claim a whole continent. So let's assume that it was legitimate of the British to take over the land and then bring cattle and then breed cattle, breed sheep for wool, right? And then this farmer, right, He's breeding the sheep, and then the wool gets transported back to Europe and sold on the market. What's wrong with any of that? How is that exploitative? Now he's talking about aggressive imperialism. Well, that's just a characterization. I mean, yeah, of course, if you're a communist, but I mean, it's not like the Russian Soviets were not aggressive. I mean, they took over a big giant country. You could say that's aggressive imperialism. It's so ridiculous. Anyway, so the income of the rentiers, which means the business people, is 5 times greater than the income obtained from the foreign trade of the biggest trading country in the world. Exclamation point. This is the essence of imperialism and imperialist parasitism. For that reason, that the term rentier state or usurer state is coming into common use in the economic literature that deals with imperialism. This is just a lot of communist garbage, as far as I'm concerned. So what does Parvini say?
And its people, or for the glory of America and its people, but rather for the narrow and private interests of the capitalist and its people. I got better rates than meals.
Sure. And so...
Now anyway, where were we? What is crucial to understand here is that for Lenin, imperialism is not done for the glory of Britain and its people, or for the glory of America and its people, but rather for the narrow and private interests of the capitalist rentier class.
Yeah, because that is the best thing. Voluntary exchanges are what creates economic wealth. I'm sorry to break it to you, but economic planning doesn't work. And this man has proven it. And why would someone on the right have any problem with voluntary exchanges is baffling. I just can't square it. I don't understand it. It's like you have to argue with leftists about this, and now you have to argue with people on the right that communism is not a good idea. It's my mind is completely, I don't know, frozen, exploding. I don't know what the adjective is, but it's baffling. It's just I am completely baffled.
According to Lenin, the 5 characteristics of imperialism are as follows, and I'm going to go through each 5 of them now. So number 1 is economic concentration, and we can see in 2020.
Now, I asked Parvini in a comment to explain the previous passage. He said that he did in this, but this doesn't really explain. I mean, he just, okay, now Lenin is making some stuff up about economic concentration. Well, which countries are known to have the highest economic concentration? Socialist countries, right? Listen to there's a video by Peter Hitchens about his time when he was living in Moscow during the Soviet, it was, I think, in the 70s. Basically, everyone was dirt poor, and he was living in this upmarket apartment block that was basically for members of the Communist Party. I mean, why are we have to tell these people to people on the right? Why? I mean, yeah, these people are very rich. Is it because of the free market? I don't think so. I mean, the US prints money like there's no tomorrow. Is that the free market? I think in the US, it's the government that is in charge of that, isn't it? I mean, if people had free money, meaning if they could choose which money to use, they would probably choose money that is not fiat. I mean, that's a discussion, right? The US stock market is going up because of the money printing. That's my understanding of it. I think this needs to be mentioned in this context.
The richest 1% of individuals in the world owned 45.8% of global wealth. In 2024, the top 10 companies in the world accounted for...
Yeah. So you have these aggregates, but to go back to what we said about the Austrian school, is that so what? If there was one company that owned everything and people voluntarily bought its product and said, yes, we love what you're giving us, it makes no difference as long as that company... Now, and the question is, well, what is wealth, right? I mean, of course, when energy is such a huge... say energy, right? It's a massive input into the production process, and it takes a lot of capital, means a lot of money, to buy the machinery, to extract the energy out of the ground. Then those companies will generally be a large part of an aggregate in terms of what they own. Well, they own oil rigs. Those are very expensive. You have a lot of those. They own all the a lot of the transportation, a lot of the they own a lot of stuff so that you can put fuel in your car or heat your home. So what we should... okay, I agree. It would be better if there's more competition, more diversity, but you're not going to have a lot of small firms doing that. There'll be several large firms. And then, so there is the question of too much concentration. But this doesn't tell you, because these aggregates do not look at specific industries and about the regulations and the role of the government, and if there is no competition, why is there no competition? And this is what people at the Mises Institute discuss. They look at a particular industry and go, why is there a lack of competition in this industry? Is it because of the inherent nature of the industry, where it's very difficult to, for example, have competing train lines, right? You can only have like one train track at a time. You can't have several different train lines competing the way you might have, say, airlines. So there are specifics to a particular industry, and then how much economic concentration is reasonable, and the question whether it's beneficial or detrimental. No, let's have these aggregates, and it's bad. It's just inherently bad.
For 19.5% of the index's
and it's bad because Lenin said so.
Market capitalization, a figure that has steadily risen. And in the interest of academic integrity, I can tell you these stats come from the communist channel Red Star, where you can find a lecture that was given there by some Indian dude.
Right. So the right is now getting their stats from communists.
Okay, second, we have finance capital dominance. banks become dominant in controlling capital and merge with industrial capital and practically all the other sectors of society.
Yeah, well, that's a no-brainer. I mean, banks are just printing. You have my understanding, which is just someone who follows the Mises Institute and listens to their lecture, that basically fractional reserve banking is essentially money printing. That the banks do not lend out money that they got from someone, like your deposits. I can't fully understand how it works, but that's the idea. That basically it's too advanced economics for my brain. But they basically create the money. So some of the guys like George Gammon, he says, well, actually, most of the inflation, meaning most of the expansion of the money supply, isn't the government printing. It's the banks. It's the banking system. But they're allowed to do that. They're able to do that because of central banks. Basically, they're taking a risk, right? And a lot of that money printing goes toward unproductive investments, like real estate bubbles, all this kind of stuff. Because if they go under, they're going to be bailed out. So again, it's not a free market. And that is the Austrian position, as best as I understand. It's not a free market when you have a central bank setting interest rates, making interest rates very low, and bailing out banks that make bad loans.
This fusion of Wall Street and Main Street is called finance capital and represents the emergence of an oligarchy. In 2023, the assets of the world's top 50 largest banks combined amounted to around 89 trillion that is, dollars, which is bigger than the combined GDP of the USA, China, Japan, Germany, India, Russia, UK, and France. This is around 50% of all of the world's banking assets just in those top 50.
I mean, I can't say that I understand what any of this means. Okay. And Parvini doesn't seem to want to explain, but it's just throwing a lot of numbers and characterizations. This is the problem, is that Parvini seems to be taking this communist way of characterizing things, like finance capital. It has kind of this every leftist, like when you listen to these leftists, like that Greek guy, he was the finance minister in Greece. He has this tone, and it's all this, basically leftist gobbledygook, but he sounds very authoritative because he's in finance. And I mean, there was this video of this guy who's a finance guy in the US, and someone asked him, well, if the government can print money, why does it need to borrow money? And he goes, it borrows money and prints money, but I don't know why. Like, I don't understand it. This was like, a big thing. This guy, he's in the administration, he doesn't understand how the government does it. He's just an idiot. And this is the reality. A lot of these people, no one understands. It's too complicated, but they have an authoritative tone, and they throw a lot of numbers, these aggregates, and everyone's like, wow, finance capital, that sounds scary. It's all tone. And I kind of started catching on to how 90% or more of stuff like that's written is just tone. Like and this what kind of alerted me to this is reading some French philosophy. I was like, I was like into, studying boring, analytic Anglo philosophy. I can't try some of this French philosophy. This analytic stuff is boring. It's very dry. So I started reading this French guy. After 2 lines, I concluded that these French guys, generally, they just love the sound of their own voice. It's just talking because I'm French and I'm an intellectual and I'm gonna throw a lot of big words and it just seems like random words, put together. But there are pages of that. I'm like, I don't understand it, but it just sounds to me like this guy loves the sound of his own voice, and he's not gonna try to explain anything. No, that's too boring because I am a French intellectual in Paris and I'm smoking my cigarette. It's just all nonsense. I mean, there might be something there. I don't know. But until someone shows me that there is something there and I keep hearing about it, it's there's no reason for me to just buy into any of it. And this is just communist tone. The question is this stuff producing stuff? Is it producing products? Is it delivering products? If yes, then okay, it can be 100 trillion. I don't care. It's providing value.